The early 17th century was the ground for a new era of philosophical thought. Building on the development of the arts and the sciences backed by the wealthy patrons of the Renaissance, philosophy became tasked with acquiring knowledge through these uniquely human endeavours. Answers were not to be merely given by divine authority, but to be proven by those daring to know. This was the beginning of the Enlightenment. This most radical break in philosophical thought, and perhaps the foundation of all modern philosophy, would find its unification in a quiet declaration. In the darkness of one man's study, removing himself from the world and bringing himself to the light by his reason and his alone. This is the study of René Descartes, and this is one of philosophy's greatest stories. René Descartes was born in 1596 into a Europe reaping the rich developments of the Renaissance. His exposure to military engineering in his time as a mercenary, and the automatons exhibited in the neighbourhoods of Paris where he lived, undoubtedly influenced his interest in understanding how things operate and function. In the spirit of the scientists and the mathematicians of the time, Descartes took this drive and made important contributions to mathematics that we still use today. Notably, his unification of algebra and geometry, using the former to describe the latter, the Cartesian axes, which are themselves a foundational system that can be used to build geometry, and also standardizing the notation of writing exponential powers, such as squared and cubic numbers, in superscript. But Descartes was not finished. He carried his inquiry to the realms of philosophy, leaving us to ponder the question at the heart of his work: what things can we know with absolute certainty? If the sciences are to be a valid method of deriving truth and meaning from the world, then they must be based on a foundation of absolute certainty. If there is a flaw or imperfection in this foundation, then everything else built upon it would be subject to those same flaws and essentially be worthless. The stakes could not be higher. In 1640, Descartes finished and published his Meditations, an outline of the method by which he was able to arrive at a number of certainties about the world, onto which other truths could be built. In the introduction, addressed to the theological department of the university in Paris, Descartes explains the rationale for his undertaking. I have always thought that two issues, namely God and the soul, are chief among those that ought to be demonstrated with the aid of philosophy rather than theology. For although it suffices for us believers to believe by faith that the human soul does not die with the body, and that God exists, certainly no unbelievers seem capable of being persuaded of any religion, or even of almost any moral virtue, until these two are first proven to them by natural reason. Here we see the radical break that Descartes is going to make with established theology. Rather than relying on the word of the Bible or the voice of the Church to express truth in the first instance, Descartes is going to use philosophy as a science to prove certain immovable facts about the world. Those that do not believe in Christianity will never be persuaded by something they do not believe in. So instead, Descartes will begin with something they must believe in as fact, and proceed from that starting point to prove other truths about the existence of God, the soul, and so on. It should be emphasized that Descartes is not attempting to displace the truth that Christianity presents, but to prove that if we rely on our own thoughts and reasoning, we will inevitably arrive at those same truths that Christianity presents. To present any other conclusion would have made it impossible to publish this work. He had already withheld other writings from publication, after Galileo's similar writing on the scientific method was condemned by the Church. Descartes wrote the Meditations in common French, rather than the typical Latin, so that as many people as possible would be able to follow this method that he presented. And with this in mind, it would have been important that he was able to get this published to fulfill this objective. Despite his intention to prove the authority of the Church, Descartes, naively or otherwise, did displace the voice of the Church as the provider of knowledge, that one should start by thinking for themselves, regardless of whether the conclusion aligns with the Church or not, would have repercussions not only for Descartes' work, but also become a starting point for a new kind of philosophy, that of science, and the period in Western philosophy which would become known as the Enlightenment, We shall return to the measurement of this impact at the end. So, let us follow in Descartes' footsteps, or thoughts, and enact his scientific method, and in turn we shall see what conclusions he found by thinking for himself. Several years have now passed, Descartes writes, since I realised how numerous were the false opinions that in my youth I had taken to be true, and thus how doubtful were all those that I had suddenly built upon them. And thus I realised that once in my life I had to raze everything to the ground and begin again from the original foundations, if I wanted to establish anything firm and lasting in the sciences. To begin our task to find the original foundations of truth, Descartes asks us to cast out any suppositions or beliefs that we have built up throughout our lives. If we cannot be certain of its truth, it must be cast aside. Rather than attempting to interrogate every fact or idea that he has in his mind, he instead employs a method by which to remove them entirely from his thoughts. This is the method of radical doubt, by which we mean we will start our meditations by doubting everything we believe to be true. This is a purely, uniquely philosophical move, in the sense that this doubt, at its most general and non-specific, is not limited to individual disciplines or forms of knowledge. Everything can be subject to this form of doubt. We find ourselves, upon this night, at the desk of our study, quiet and dimly lit. With the minimal intrusion upon our senses, we are left alone with our thoughts, which we must now subject to our method of radical doubt. Let us start our interrogation with these aforementioned senses. Can we doubt what our senses tell us? The answer must be yes, for it is easy to recall times that our senses tell us that an object is small, but it is in fact far in the distance. Or perhaps we hear our name being called from behind, but we turn around and it is only a name similar to our own. Although we could interrogate specific examples almost endlessly, we must stick to our method of philosophical generality to guide our path. If the question is, can the senses be, for any reason, be doubted, then the answer must be yes. Our doubt can carry us further still. Can we doubt that any of the external world, anything that is happening to us, is real? Descartes uses the example of the dream, that when we dream, we often have no notion of being asleep until we wake. Everything we may experience when we are awake could feasibly happen to us in a dream, so these experiences also must be cast aside for now. Are we at least able to say with absolute certainty that our bodies exist? That when I raise my hand in front of my face, it cannot be doubted that I am doing so? Even in this, Descartes imagines a demon or an evil genius that could implant the very idea that I have a body into my mind. Nowadays, we would liken this to the Matrix, that everything we sense and experience is but a simulation that could be implanted into our brains that float helplessly in a jar. So by simply following our method of philosophical doubt, we have cast aside many of the ideas that could be used to provide a foundation for truth, and thus far have not found our fundamental truth that cannot be doubted. This will require another night of our meditations. The sun sets on our daily life, and once again we find ourselves in this darkened study, ready to resume our meditations. During the day, we need not consider these private matters of doubt. We do not need to worry about the existence of our bodies when we go to work, or whether the groceries we pick up while shopping are real. But when we enact our philosophical method of doubt, we must not hold back. On the previous night, we had nearly doubted our way out of our own existence. Our senses, experiences, and even our bodies can run afoul of deception and trickery, and thus can be subject to our radical doubt. All the while, however, it cannot be denied that there is an I who is doing the doubting. If my senses can mislead me, I must be the one who is misled. If my experiences are a dream, it is I who must doubt that dream. If a demon is planting all my ideas about the world and my body into my mind, I must exist to be deceived. Nobody can doubt for me, and as long as I can doubt, I must exist to doubt. I am, I exist, Descartes writes, is necessarily true every time I utter it or conceive it in my mind. This statement is more popularly remembered in its Latin phrase used elsewhere in his writing, cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. Again, there cannot be doubt unless there is someone to do the doubting. Because of this, I can confirm my own existence as a thinking, doubting entity. It is the one immovable truth that cannot be dreamed, fabricated, or simulated. As mentioned, we may wish for the next step to be to confirm the existence of our bodies, but everything we experience by the body and the senses can still be doubted. We can mishear things, be misled by our taste, smell, and so on. We cannot rely on the operations of the body to prove its own existence. We must proceed from the position of absolute certainty to prove the existence of the body based upon that. Descartes takes the example of the sole candle flickering away at his desk. I watch the wax melt as the candle burns, but as the shape changes, I still recognise it as a candle, and that same candle. Anything we may know about this candle can still be doubted, but I cannot doubt that my mind is thinking about candles when I look at this waxy, burning object. We are led to conclude that what we know for certain we understand from the mind. We have arrived back where we started this night, with our thoughts firmly planted on the grounds of certainty. But we also have learned from this first step that we know our bodies through our mind, rather than through the body's own senses. My mind knows my body, but my body does not know my mind in the same way. This is also the first step in distinguishing the mind from the body, but we shall not rush ahead on this point, and instead return to our meditations another night. My mind, that doubts, is the one thing that I can know for certain. Likewise, my mind can imagine and perceive, but the contents of this imagination and perception could have no basis in reality. I could imagine our candle to have a certain smell, colour, or texture, but that doesn't make it so. Furthermore, the candle's properties that I detect through the senses rather than imagination can still be subject to my doubting, as some god or deity or demon could simply present falsities to my mind to deceive me entirely. If I cannot prove that God exists, and that God will not deceive me in any way, I can never be certain of anything beyond the activity of my own mind. This will be the next task that occupies our meditations. We understand by God an eternal, infinite, omniscient, omnipresent being who is the creator of all things. In short, if God exists, he is the origin of all reality and must be more real than all other things. We turn to our scientific method of reasoning to investigate this. The first step he's going to do is to make the statement that a cause always precedes its effect. An effect cannot produce more than its cause. All that can be derived from an effect could be derived from its cause. So, in essence, a cause must be more real than its effect. We have established that the mind is known first and thus distinguishable from the body and material world. My mind could be the cause of these material substances, but that would not make them real. They could be a mixture of imagination and misrepresentation, for example. Remember how easily it is for our mind to confuse certain ideas, ideas of measurement, analysis, and so on. All of those are contained within me as a thinking being, so attempting to derive reality from these ideas equally could be prone to such confusion and error. We are left with the idea of God. Could this idea of God have, similar to all my other ideas, been an act of imagination or error? Because the idea of God is, as we have mentioned, all-powerful, eternal, infinite, and the cause of all reality, there is no way, following this reasoning of cause and effect, that God can simply be be an effect of my own mind, that I have made it up. The idea of perfection and the infinite could not have been conceived by my mind, which we have shown to be finite and subject to error. As such, that idea must have come from outside of my mind, from a perfect, eternal, all-powerful and existing being, and this, according to Descartes, is proof that God must exist. To put it another way, because I doubt and recognise my finitude, there must be an infinity to which I recognise my own limits. This idea of God and its qualities of infinity and perfection cannot be made by my mind, according to Descartes, nor by some mischievous outsider implanting the idea in my mind. To implant that idea of perfection in my mind, it must necessarily exist to be put there. If God is cause and I am the effect, it stands to this reasoning that I could identify this cause in the same manner as I identify my own thoughts, such as Descartes has shown here. God, in their infinitude, cannot make mistakes and cannot be a deceiver. Thereby, we recognise them as perfect and inherently good. That we have proved that something exists outside of ourselves, namely God, is a big step in our meditations and our quest for what we can rely on with certainty. This, of course, opens up the possibility for other things to exist with certainty, but our discoveries this night are perhaps so significant that we should meditate on them before we proceed quickly to other truths we can find. Our previous meditations have led us to consider the certainties of the world from the doubts of our own thoughts. Our mind has no worldly extension to be measured. It has no height, no depth, nor volume, for example. From the fact that I am doubting, I can see myself as an imperfect being who makes mistakes and confuses ideas. The fact that I can recognise the idea of God, who must be the perfect being, who cannot make mistakes and can never deceive, in my imperfect mind, must mean that it was God himself that allows himself to be recognised, since no imperfect being, however slight, could create such an idea. While we have certainty about our own doubts and about the existence of a God, there is still a limitless amount between these two which we are yet to be certain of. Rather than interrogate every single idea and object in the universe, we need a method to be able to separate truth from falsehoods whenever the need arises. Now, our previous meditations present us with a question. If God is perfect, then why should he create beings that are imperfect? Would that not itself be a flaw? We find ourselves, as individuals, cannot possibly perceive the purpose and reasons for the existence of things as a whole. That the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, with God as the whole and myself as a part, puts an infinite divide between us. There is also no proof that God needed to give any more perfection to us in order for us to understand all that we need to. As long as we use the faculties of our minds, our free will predisposes us to choose certain things, and the stronger we are inclined to things, the more the good and the divine appear to us. Freedom is not indifference. It is quite the opposite, as indifference includes a disregard for one's own will and in making decisions. If our free will leads us into error, it is because we misuse the faculties that God has given us to reason and to understand. But we always have the free will to not follow these if we so choose. So whenever we get things wrong, or we are led astray by our own thoughts, that is the fault of our own, and it is nothing to do with God. It is entirely on us. So God retains this idea that he never deceives and he is perfect. Any falsity or deception is our fault, not his. The source of falsity and error revealed to us on this night is that which stems from the inappropriate use of our faculties, and not from God. Remember, we must proceed from that which we are certain, that is, we exist, first and foremost. as thinking, doubting individuals. Because of this finitude and the limits of our thoughts, we can easily transgress those limits where our understanding can fail us. Setting our mind to task in the world of ideas, we have managed to find some certainties about our existence, and indeed outside of it. However, one thing we have yet to reconcile with our method of determining existence is that of material things. On the second night of our meditations, we were able to show that we know of our mind and our existence before we know of our bodies and what we sense. We also know that we can doubt these senses, but we cannot doubt that we are doubting. Now that we can confirm the certainty of things outside of ourselves, such as God, and also how to determine truth and falsehood, we can now turn our attention to addressing our knowledge of material things. To do this, we must first address the ideas of material things in my mind, and whether these ideas are clear or confused. When the philosophers, which we may refer to nowadays as scientists, attend to the material world, they know it through their continuous qualities. By this, we mean that every material thing has quantities we can measure, such as length, width, depth, duration, volume, and so on. We can split material things in many different ways and get many different measurements based on this. Let us remember to focus on the ideas that come into our mind. In doing so, we find a continuum of numbers, figures, and geometry that originate in my mind that can be used to grasp certain quantities about the world. These ideas present themselves with such clarity to my mind, it is as though they have always been present, waiting for me to make use of them. Take the example of a triangle. I know what a triangle is, but I can neither say that I got this idea from the material world, where there are no perfect triangles, neither can I say that I simply made up the idea of triangles in my mind. Because as I uncover their properties, such as how the three angles in a triangle equal 180 degrees, they never entered my mind when I first learned of triangles, and so they must have existed independent of myself. So says Descartes. This is also, analogously, another proof of the existence of God, specifically that we cannot distinguish God's existence from his essence. Just as the existence of three angles equaling 180 degrees cannot be separated from the existence of a triangle, so can the idea of God not be separated from his actual existence. If we can think of the idea of perfection in all degrees, then it must exist for our minds to apprehend it. Not existing would be an imperfection, something which God lacks, so God must surely exist. Because we know that God, according to Descartes, is the first idea outside of ourselves that we can be certain of, we are able to make use of that certainty to find other truths about the world, such as the example of the aforementioned triangle. And it is only through relying on this certainty that God exists and that I think, and clarity, that we will know other ideas with the same clarity, rather than the confused ideas which we may imagine or mistake things for. Now that we know that the ideas by which we can apprehend material things exist, it must be time to prove that these material things actually exist as well. We must presuppose their existence as objects of mathematics, which we have already established certainty for, such as the example of the triangle. So the existence of material things must be based on their mathematical quantities. We do this, Descartes remarks, by the use of our imagination, which he states is a certain application of the faculty of knowledge to the body, which is immediately present to it, and therefore exists. To clarify what Descartes is saying here, it is necessary to distinguish between two types of imagination. If I imagine our triangle once again, I can grasp its properties, such as its three sides, with clarity and immediacy. If I try to imagine a thousand-sided shape, I will not get the same clarity that I get with my triangle. It would be impossible to imagine a thousand sides at once, or to distinguish it from many other sided shapes that I could imagine. We can, of course, imagine such a shape, but that shape would lack clarity, such as if we were to imagine a horse with wings, for example. And so here we have a distinction between our imagination and pure intellect, that our body impresses itself upon us with such clarity and immediacy, such as the triangle itself does, it must mean that it exists. That our body impresses itself upon us with such clarity and immediacy, such as the triangle itself does, must mean that it exists. Although Descartes offered a proof on the existence of mathematical figures, he ultimately concedes that he cannot offer a certain proof for the body's existence, like he has done so far. He does continue, however, to say that if such an immediate inclination that we have a body was in fact an error, it would be a matter for God, as a perfect being, to intervene and give us the means to confirm such a huge error about our own existence. The fact that we cannot find such an error means that, and because God is perfectly good and would never deceive us, must mean that the body exists, because we have no reason to doubt it. Although Descartes offers multiple proofs of the existence of our bodies and how it is affected and influenced by our minds, the type of mind-body dualism typically characterized by Cartesianism establishes an independence between the body and the mind, and it was such a compounding, compelling argument that many of the Enlightenment philosophers that succeeded him would have to provide their own solution to this supposed mind-body dualism before they could outline their own philosophical system. Such was the significance of Descartes' work. Our meditations are reaching the limits of their usefulness, it seems, where we begin to depart from our search for certainty and begin to rely on imagination, no matter how clear and immediate. The initial impetus that founded our meditations begins to fade into irrelevance. We must emerge from our nightly thoughts and back into the busy routines of daily life, a world in which we do not need to consider the nature of existence in order to actually exist. We have perhaps merely confirmed what we already knew, but we have arrived at it through a specific method that we have devised that relied solely on the ability to think for ourselves. Descartes' impact on Western philosophy was so profound that it set it on a new course through the period which would come to be known as the Enlightenment. He placed the material world firmly under the remit of the new sciences, that of Galileo and Copernicus, to investigate this world using geometry, mathematics, and the study of motion. The mind, ethics, and the soul would stay rooted within the remit of theology. We may look at Descartes as a radical thinker who sought to unshackle philosophy from the oversight of the Church, but Descartes himself was a devout Catholic and aimed his meditations in particular at skeptics who doubted even God. His method of doubt to derive truth can certainly be interpreted as wresting truth away from the organisations so centred on faith. Perhaps Descartes was simply naive about the implications of his work being carried in directions that he could not consider as being a devout Catholic. Some 40 years after the Meditations were released, and 30 years after Descartes' death, his work was banned by the Church as heretical, which perhaps made his work seem even more of a radical break than he originally intended. Nevertheless, Descartes' story, whether he intended it to be or not, set about a revolution in Western philosophy, one that would lead others to pursue the philosophy as a science and set the stage for Western philosophy for the next 300 years.